Seattle was living its evening life louder and louder. The lights of office towers, neon signs of clubs and bars, streams of cars flocking from the outer suburbs to the center. The air was filled with a sense of adventure and the kind of light madness that often appears in a big city when night falls. On the 25th floor of one of the glass skyscrapers was the spacious apartment of the white couple, where the evening lights had already begun to flash. The wide panoramic windows of the living room overlooked the city at night, and it was here that Brian stood, leaning on the windowsill, a slender, dark-haired boy of 28, with an expression of hidden fatigue and thirst for something new at the same time. He was looking out at the street, as if wondering where his life would go from here. The spacious living room was lined with soft sofas and armchairs, as if ready to receive the next group of guests who often came to the Whites' home. The design of the apartment reflected their dynamic style. Scandinavian minimalist furniture, comfortable poof, and a few bright accents in the form of art posters and expensive gadgets. The atmosphere of youthful freedom was evident in every object. The apartment was not only their home, but also a center of their social activity. In the kitchen, Melissa, a 26-year-old charming girl with light makeup and blonde hair in a bun, was fussing. She was looking through the cabinets, trying to find glasses for future guests. However, her lips were slightly compressed and her movements were tense. It seemed that something was oppressing her. She was really talented at organizing events. She worked for an event agency, handling the logistics of events from corporate events to parties. But in her own life, she had recently been lacking emotional organization. Despite her openness and sociability, Melissa felt tired of the lack of real intimacy with her husband. Although they both had a fairly successful life without children, Melissa often found herself thinking that something had broken down in their emotional unity. Conversations with Brian had become short, evenings noisy and blurred by constant meetings and parties, and there was little real frank communication left. When they met 4 years ago, they immediately felt a powerful attraction. Brian, then a young aspiring IT specialist, impressed Melissa with his creative approach to everything. He was incredibly sociable, could hold conversations with engineers, designers, and marketers alike, and had a million ideas. Melissa was fascinated by his energy, the feeling that he never stopped for a moment, always ahead, looking for opportunities, trying new things. For her part, Melissa had always been the life of the party among her friends, but she lacked someone with whom she felt safe. With Brian, she felt that she could fly without fear of falling, because he could catch her on the fly, support and motivate her. But real family life turned out to be more complicated. After the wedding, they first rented a small apartment and then saved up for a down payment and bought this spacious apartment in a modern building. At first, every holiday was like an explosion of novelty, parties, traveling, and hanging out. Everyone envied them, young, beautiful, active. However, after 3 years, this lifestyle became a routine for Melissa, who still wanted something more stable. She felt that youth doesn't last forever and dreamed of the next step, perhaps a child, or at least a more serious family arrangement. Instead, Brian began to be even more full of ideas and desire for extreme sports. He would go skydiving, fly to international hackathons with enthusiasm, or organize noisy barbecues. It seemed that he was attracted to the eternal change of scenery, and Melissa could not tie him to her. She suffered in silence. She did not dare to speak, because she was afraid that it would only push him further away. Melissa hinted to Brian several times, "Can't we just sit quietly together today?" But he replied, "No way, I've already arranged a meeting with the guys. We have a postponed quest at the VR club. We have a game night with friends tonight," and so on. These responses were becoming increasingly painful for Melissa. She felt unnecessary, trying to keep up with his pace. But there was something missing in her heart. Simple warmth and intimacy. She posted happy photos on social media, took selfies from parties to hide her sadness and create the appearance of a perfect life. For Brian, it was different. He would see Melissa getting grumpy or bored and think she needed to vent. He didn't think she could suffer so much from the lack of time together. Besides, he was on the verge of a major career leap at his IT company, making plans to break into a startup or create his own virtual reality project. He didn't want to stop spending the energy he had on new achievements. It was against this backdrop that the idea to celebrate Brian's 28th birthday came up. loudly in the style of Burning Man on minimalist clothes, or something like that. Melissa tried to be happy, helped with the preparations. Although she was very bitter in her heart, she didn't want just another party. She wanted to feel that she was being paid attention to personally. She was frustrated to see Brian running up to one friend and down to another, giving out instructions and instructions about music, food, and alcohol, while only talking to her about the grocery list. When the evening of the party came, the apartment turned into a kind of nightclub. Disco balls, a smoke machine, powerful speakers, and tables with goodies. A good 30 people were invited, and it was all quite loud and chaotic. Melissa was the hostess, waitress, and manager at the same time. She tried to smile and take pictures of the guests for social media, but she felt lonely inside. At that moment, she was approached by Nick, 31, and Bella, 24, old friends with whom they had once gone on vacation together. Nick is a calm, logical worker in a marketing company, and Bella is a young, cheerful co-working administrator, always positive, bold, and open to experiments. Gail's family had become quite close to the Whites because both spouses loved outdoor activities, often traveling to the mountains and seaside. Nick adored a calm, logical approach to planning, so he liked that Brian could figure out how to organize a cool trip, and Melissa could do the detailed preparation. Bella, on the other hand, was younger and treated Nick with a certain amount of respect, but at the same time she wanted more excitement in her life. The couple had been married for only a year and were already feeling the honeymoon was over. When they entered the White's apartment, Brian, after toasting them, immediately went to greet them with a joyful smile. Melissa was pleased to see familiar faces, but she also noticed that Bella gave Brian a very energetic hug and added, "Oh, the birthday boy is always so hot." Melissa felt something tight inside, but she tried not to show it. The party was getting into full swing. The alcohol was flowing, the music was blaring. Brian was the center of attention, the star of the evening. Melissa was on the periphery, although she tried to show goodwill. Around 1 a.m., when the number of guests had dwindled a bit, the heartiest remained. In the circle where Whitey and Gail were sitting, a lively conversation started about how to diversify life, crazy ideas, and so on. Someone jokingly mentioned what happens when couples have a little fun with other partners. The most poignant phrase came from Brian, who, while drunk, made a challenge. "How about we switch partners for the night, huh?" At first, everyone laughed, thinking it was a joke. But then Bella, too, playfully pretending to be daring, answered, I like that idea." Nick and Melissa fell silent and looked at each other with confused looks. At that moment, Brian and Bella were probably not just joking around anymore. They had a spark that would lead to disaster long afterward. Melissa felt her throat tighten, but she couldn't say no outright in front of everyone, especially since her husband was so vocal about it. Nick, forced to respond to this challenge, also smiled weakly, said something like, "Well, it's crazy, but ha ha," and everyone laughed. It seemed like just stupid, drunken jokes. However, Melissa and Nick felt uncomfortable inside. When the party came to an end and they were left half-consciously cleaning up the empty bottles, it became clear that Brian was not giving up on the idea of turning this joke into reality. The Haleys were eagerly supportive, convincing each other that it was just a one-time thing, for fun, no hard feelings. And in the morning, they made a strange pact that was to change their fates forever. The next morning, when the sun had already risen above the city skyline, Melissa woke up in her bedroom in a state of half-sleep. The party had been crazy last night, and now she had a headache and felt tired. But worst of all, she was tormented by the thought of what had happened at the finish line of the celebration, when Brian had suggested that they all try to switch partners for the night, and surprisingly, almost everyone had agreed. Melissa's mind raced with questions. Did they really mean it? Was it a drunken joke? Why couldn't I just say no? What is wrong with me? She glanced over at her husband. He was awake too, stretching out on the bed, looking at his phone. Melissa wanted to start a conversation with him, but she was afraid. Brian beat her to it. "How are you? Didn't you think we ran out of ideas yesterday?" he said, smiling, but his words were full of curiosity. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously, although she knew what he meant. "Well, about what we offered the Hales, the exchange for a night or something." Melissa twitched her shoulders, looking away. I have a hard time believing you're serious, she said quietly. Honestly, Brian sighed, I thought it was a cool way to spice up our lives. But if it's too weird for you, we can just forget it. His voice sounded a little too light, as if he were suggesting a new quest. However, something in his eyes indicated that he did not want to just forget. Melissa felt it. Two poles were fighting inside her. The fear of losing her husband, thinking that maybe his thrill-seeking would suddenly get in the way if she didn't support the adventure, and her common sense, which told her that this was a path to disaster. Meanwhile, the mood at the Gales house was also one of questions and doubt. Nick was brewing coffee, trying to get ready for work, and Bella was in bed, flipping through her phone. When he thought back to last night, he felt a slight tightening in his chest. Did we really agree to this? Do we dare? He remembered how, when he was drunk, he wanted to keep up appearances in front of his friends because of jealousy and ego. But now that he was sober, it didn't seem logical. Bela, on the other hand, smiled when she remembered the adventure idea. She liked the idea of taking risks and playing adult without commitment. However, she was also afraid that Nick might lose his temper, as she knew he was prone to jealousy. But in her eyes, this danger only fueled the intrigue. She didn't fully realize how happy this could turn out, but she wanted a thrill. A few days later, the four friends decided to meet on neutral ground in a small cafeteria. At first, there was an awkward silence between them. However, after placing their orders, everyone began to speak with feigned ease. So, we were talking after the party, Bela began, sipping her coffee. Nick and I wouldn't mind trying, although, of course, it sounds a little crazy. She glanced over at Nick, who was sitting silently, with a tense expression. Hmm? Yeah, he nodded, trying to collect himself. But only if it's under control, no more. Once, and that's it. We had our doubts too, Brian put in, squeezing Melissa's hand. But maybe this will be a kind of experiment that will bring some freshness to our relationship. Melissa was silent, biting her lips, her heart pounding with anxiety. She felt that it was wrong, but when she looked at Brian and saw the sparkle in his eyes, she couldn't speak up. She was afraid of being a break, so she just nodded, saying, okay, but she was suffering in her heart. So they agreed to have one exchange over the weekend. The Gales insisted that Nick would go with Melissa to their place, and Bella would stay with Brian at the Whites' apartment. They all emphasized no repetition, no feelings. It's just a night of fun. Everyone left with different emotions. Brian and Bella were excited and curious. Melissa and Nick had anxiety and jealousy, mixed with a kind of subconscious desire. Maybe this will do something. Maybe this is the spark that will save the family. It was Friday night, with Saturday ahead, when the experimental exchange was to take place. Melissa nervously packed her things in a small bag. She was going to spend the night at the Gales' house. The realization that she would have to share a bed with Nick made her heart flutter. She didn't know if she could even do it. Brian appeared in the hallway with a smile. Hey, it's going to be okay, he said, as if to encourage her. You wanted to change something, to diversify your relationship, right? Yeah, it's a game, Melissa whispered. I just don't know where it's going to take us. Sunam, trust me. The man smiled and kissed her cheek, but his eyes were already somewhere in the future adventures. Late at night, Melissa logged onto social media, scrolling through her feed, trying to distract herself. There she saw new photos of Bella. She was posting stories of how she was out with her friends. Bella seemed to be genuinely excited about the day ahead. Melissa felt miserable, unable to be as happy as Bella. She remembered that at the party, Bella had spoken so animatedly about extreme sports and the desire for new experiences. Melissa hung up the phone in frustration and froze in bed, closing her eyes. God, let this be quick and painless. On Saturday afternoon, Nick met Melissa at their driveway to take her to the Gables house. Brian, meanwhile, stayed in the apartment with Bella. Both spouses tried to act lighthearted, as if it were just a normal little adventure. Call me if you need anything, Melissa whispered to Brian as she left. He smiled and hugged her, but his gaze seemed to pierce the space in the direction of Bela, who was standing behind Melissa. Melissa got into Nick's car with a heavy heart. She drove in silence, staring out the window. Nick was also silent until they left the main streets. He cleared his throat and said, Look, I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable. I have a bad feeling about this too. We can do this. We won't force anything. We'll see how it goes, okay? Synonym. Thank you, Melissa exhaled. She was a little relieved to hear that Nick wasn't in the mood for anything crazy. They arrived at the cozy neighborhood where the Gables house was located, a small house with a private garden. Entering the living room, Melissa noticed that the house was neat but a little empty, as if it didn't host large parties as often as their apartment. Nick put a bottle of wine on the table and offered to have dinner with the pizza he had ordered. Melissa agreed. The evening passed without loud music. They just sat and talked about life, work, and childhood dreams. No one was touched on any sensitive topics. With each passing hour, the tension eased. Melissa was even relieved because Nick turned out to be a nice person to talk to. No flirting, no pressure. She felt at ease. At the White's apartment, however, the picture was completely different. Brian received Bella himself. She appeared in a bright blouse, dressed attractively, and immediately brought a bottle of fine wine. Well, it's just the two of us now, she said with a playful smile. Yeah, Brian winked, feeling a wave of passion rising in him. He turned on the dim lighting and put on some light background music. Bella began to talk about her new ideas on how to escape the routine and what extreme things they could try. She craved thrills, and here she saw Brian as the perfect partner for a breakaway. They drank a few glasses of wine, laughed, and talked about how sometimes there is no fire in a marriage. Brian felt that everything was heading towards intimacy, and this fired him up even more. In the end, they drowned in kisses and began their night of exchange without any moral barriers. With each passing minute, they lost control, moving from light touching to passionate love. Sparks of desire were flying in the air, and they didn't care what came afterwards. After all, it was one time, right? At the Gales' house, however, the late evening eventually brought something unexpected. Melissa and Nick did not dare to get physical. They drank wine, sat on the couch, and talked about their most intimate feelings until 1 a.m. Melissa admitted that she was very afraid that Brian was finally pulling away. Nick admitted that he was jealous of Bella, but did not know how to keep her so as not to break her spirit of freedom. I don't want to hurt you, Nick said, looking her in the eye. I know we agreed to an exchange, but it doesn't seem right when you're obviously in pain. I don't want to either. I can't, Melissa said quietly. Their conversation was warm but sad. In the end, they decided to just spend the night without crossing intimate boundaries. They felt mutual respect, which was not destroyed by animal impulses. All that remained was the thought that on the other side of town, Brian and Bella might be in bed right now. The thought of it stabbed Melissa like a needle, but she swallowed her tears in silence, pulling a blanket over herself on the couch, and Nick went to the bedroom. In the morning, they woke up relieved. Thank God we didn't cross the line. However, there was a strange aftertaste of too much trusting friendship, as if they were not lovers, but not strangers either. They both realized that this would confuse the situation even more. Back at the White's apartment, Dawn found Brian and Bella falling asleep in each other's arms. When they woke up, they were enjoying the feeling of being forbidden fruit. They were so hot and passionate that the thought of returning to normal life seemed dim. Bella smiled. Son, well, I'll have to come back to reality, she whispered. But it was too good to stop, Brian replied in a hoarse voice, and they both realized once might not be enough. When all four of them met that evening for a brief discussion, it was almost like a theater. Brian and Bella were confident, as if nothing was out of the ordinary, smiling. Melissa and Nick were quiet and tense. After a few phrases, it became clear that the intimacy was only between the newly formed couple, but Melissa and Nick, no one dared to ask directly. But Brian and Bella were suddenly silent and embarrassed. They felt uncomfortable that the other couple hadn't even taken the opportunity, but out loud everyone pretended that everything was fine. They said, "We agreed to do this once, right? So that's it, let's move on." They tried to go home thinking that this was the end of the story. However, Brian and Bella felt that they had gotten a sip of new passion and didn't want to stop. They thought, it's so exciting when it's secret, when you take risks and get thrills. They began to secretly correspond, making excuses to meet. For Brian, it was a way to escape from everyday life and his emotionally dead, in his opinion, wife. For Bella, it was a way to relieve boredom and feel welcome and alive. At that time, Melissa noticed that Brian started staying late at work, hiding his phone, and often disappearing. Nick noticed similar things with Bella. At first, Melissa tried not to believe the worst, but her intuition screamed that this was a continuation of the affair. Nick was also tormented by his guesses, but when he asked Bella, she would just joke about it. The anxiety grew, and distrust ate away at their hearts. Tension grew between Melissa and Brian, and they fought more and more often. Melissa tried to have a conversation. "You ignore me. You disappear. I know you're seeing Bella," she said with tears in her eyes. "Oh, come on," Brian said. "I have things to do, projects. Do you think I'm stupid enough to keep going?" We had an agreement, but the feeling of lying permeated these dialogues. Melissa would back down because she had no direct evidence. She would sink down on the couch thinking that her marriage was cracking. The Gables had something similar. Nick would ask Bella directly, and she would assure him, "You're imagining things. I'm just working late. We have projects." He tried to believe her, but his heart was troubled. Finally, one night, Melissa and Nick decided, "We need to get the truth." They arranged for the four of them to meet at the Gales' house to have a straight talk. Everyone showed up, although Brian and Bella seemed tense. The conversation began with Melissa and Nick asking directly, "Are you still having an affair?" Brian and Bella feigned innocence. "No, of course not. Why would you think that?" But when Melissa mentioned a few facts, fictitious business trips, synchronized disappearances of Brian and Bella, it became clear that they were caught. Bella got confused in her testimony and Brian started to get hot. The argument flared up rapidly. At one point, Melissa, blushing with pain and anger, shouted that it was a betrayal, and "If I had known, I would never have agreed to your games." Nick lost his temper and started yelling at Bella that she was humiliating him. She responded by accusing him of being too passive and unable to give her the emotions she wanted. As the accusations snowballed, emotions ran high. Melissa rushed to Brian, screaming that he had ruined everything. He shouted back that she was to blame because she couldn't make their lives more diverse. Everyone was yelling at the same time. No one was listening. The tension reached a breaking point. And then, in a fit of rage, Nick grabbed a kitchen knife from the table and began to threaten Brian. "You took my wife away from me! I'll cut you, you bastard!" He seemed to faint from raging jealousy. Brian, frightened by the knife, immediately grabbed a heavy metal object on the shelf, an iron perfume box. And when Nick rushed to him, Brian hit him in the head with fright and furious anger. Nick fell down and dropped the knife. Bella and Melissa screamed. Brian stood there with a pale face holding a bloody box. Nick didn't move. Melissa leaned over him and saw the blood. His head had been punctured. Bella screamed and pressed her hands to her mouth. In an instant, the party turned into a bloody drama. "Call an ambulance," Melissa shouted. Bella rushed to the phone, shaking with panic. Brian stood in a daze, looking at his victim. He didn't mean to kill, but he was panicking and defending himself. The ambulance and police arrived, but they could not save Nick. The fatal blow to his skull was fatal. It was late in the evening when the ambulance and police cars arrived at the Gales' house. A full moon was hanging in the sky, and its cold light mixed with the red and blue flashes of the lights to create an eerie scene. The yard was illuminated by headlights, and the doors of the house opened and closed, letting paramedics, investigators, and operatives in. In the living room, there were traces of blood everywhere, and Nick was lying on the floor without signs of life. Next to him were Melissa and Bella, who were in a state of shock. Brian stood aside, clutching a damn metal box with traces of blood in his hands. The first policeman to enter quickly assessed the situation. "Everyone who can stand, don't move," he proclaimed, approaching Brian. "Put that thing down and raise your hands." Brian, as if hypnotized, did as he was told. His eyes were blank, as if he had not yet fully realized what had happened. The paramedics immediately pronounced Nick dead. Bella fell to her knees, sobbing loudly, repeating, "No, no, no." Melissa could barely breathe, wiping away her tears. Without further ado, the police handcuffed Brian and took him outside. They put him in a car. At the same time, other patrol officers began interviewing witnesses. Melissa, who was trembling, was taken outside and given a blanket. Bella did not let go of her husband's body until she was also forcibly taken away from him. Detective Rogers, who arrived with a group of investigators, examined the crime scene. Bloodstains, scattered items, a knife lying around. It looked like a fight. The neighbors, woken up by the sirens, came out in their bathrobes, discussing what had happened. Everyone's imagination drew a terrifying picture. Four friends, night, a fatal blow. The detective began to ask questions as usual, while instructing his team to take pictures and seize evidence. At dawn, the police officially announced Nick Gale was found dead. Bella was hysterical and dizzy. She was offered medical care. Melissa was also hospitalized for a short time because she was in severe shock. Brian was taken to the police station, where he was charged with preliminary murder. The news spread like wildfire on social media and in local media. Journalists were already waiting outside the police station in the morning. A young family, a party, a murder motivated by jealousy? Sensational headlines lured the audience. Gossip and versions multiplied. People were outraged and wanted details. Some, hearing that it was a partner swap, started a real flurry of moralizing or shocked interest in the comments. For Bella, the blow was unbearable. She lost her husband, and she also realized that her safe games with Brian, which were only meant to dilute the routine a little, had become a catalyst for the tragedy. She was also blamed by the public, and in a way, she felt guilty herself, even though she was not legally responsible. Melissa, on the other hand, was left with a ruined marriage and a feeling that she was partly to blame for the situation, as she could have stopped this madness at the very beginning. At the police station, Brian was first interrogated by the investigator on duty, who recorded his testimony. He told in fragments that Nick had threatened him with a knife, and he had struck out in defense, not realizing the force of the blow. In his words, "I just wanted to fight back. To defend myself, it was an affect. I didn't want to kill." The investigator took notes but seemed skeptical. The excessive force of the punch and the fact that Nick died suggested that Brian may have exceeded the limits of self-defense. Later, a lawyer hired with money from Brian's parents tried to build a line of defense. "It was an attack with a knife. My client acted within the limits of permissible defense." However, the prosecutor could argue that he could have tried to retreat without inflicting a fatal blow with a box directly to the head. In addition, the testimony of Bella and Melissa that Nick was angry, but he didn't have time to actually hit him, complicated the situation. Melissa was summoned for questioning the next day. Nervously wringing her hands, she told the whole story: how the idea of the exchange came about, how she and Nick had no intimacy, but Bella and Brian did, how then suspicions and betrayals began, and everything exploded that night. "I remember Nick grabbing a knife," she sobbed. "He was insanely jealous, saying he was going to kill Brian. But Brian immediately hit him on the head with a metal box. It looked very strong. I don't know if he could have defended himself in any other way, but..." She broke off before finishing her sentence. Bella also gave similar testimony, but added that Nick had been unstable lately because of her affair with Brian, and it was still an impulsive act on both sides. "My husband, he was in a state of wild jealousy," Bella cried. "But Brian knew very well that a fight could happen. Perhaps he could have knocked out the knife instead of hitting him like that." The stories of two women who had lost virtually everything, one her husband, the other her trust and love, made a sad impression on the investigators. Brian's situation was complicated by the fact that there were testimonies that he had slept with Bella even after the one-night stand, had been cheating on his wife, and therefore had a motive to hide the relationship and was in a state of nervous tension. The story gained a lot of publicity and was a sensation for the local media. Married couples who swapped partners and the tragedy that happened because of jealousy. Magazines love such headlines. Battles broke out on social media. "This is all debauchery" versus "a sad accident." Some people supported Brian, saying he defended himself against the knife, while others said he killed deliberately because he was afraid of exposure. At the trial, the prosecutor said the defendant deliberately inflicted a fatal blow. Perhaps he did not plan to kill, but he definitely exceeded self-defense. The defense lawyer tried to prove that it was a short-term emotional affect because his life was threatened with a knife. The jury, after hearing everything, decided that Brian was guilty of negligent homicide, or a certain state qualification. The details depend on the specific laws. However, in any case, the sentence was quite severe: 13 years in prison. The judge emphasized, yes, you had the right to defend yourself, but the level of force was excessive and cause death. A heavy silence reigned in the courtroom. Bella was sobbing. She had finally lost her husband, and her lover was on his way to prison. Melissa, pale in the face, sat on the sidelines, silently wiping her tears. The public debate continued unabated. Is the sentence fair? Some believed that she should have been given more, while others thought that it was self-defense and should be justified. After the verdict, Melissa returned to her empty apartment, which still bore traces of their loud parties and once happy life. It was hard for her to even move around the rooms because everything reminded her of Brian. She was left with a broken trough, her husband in prison, guilt gnawing at her from the inside. She quit her job at the event agency, unable to live the party lifestyle anymore. Later, she moved to her sister's house in the suburbs, trying to start over. Bella was left a widow, feeling an unbearable sense of guilt. On the one hand, she fueled the affair, and on the other hand, she lost her loved one. She was depressed for a long time and quit her job as an administrator. For some time, she went to therapy to cope with the trauma. But public opinion was harsh on her. Some of her friends turned away, accusing her of being the reason Nick died because of your whims. Over time, the story was somewhat forgotten by society, but it remained an open wound for everyone involved. Months later, the local press did a small investigative report on the tragedy. It turned out that statistics often record conflicts over swinging and jealousy, although usually not so fatal. Experts argued that without emotional readiness and open communication, such experiments could lead to disaster, as jealousy is a powerful emotion. For some, this story was a lesson in how dangerous it is to play with feelings if you don't have a strong foundation of trust. It's not just light entertainment, it's an invasion of the deepest layers of the human soul. If there is dissatisfaction, lack of communication, or hidden jealousy, everything can explode. About a month after his sentencing, Brian was locked up in a state correctional facility. Life in prison was in stark contrast to his former activity and thirst for adrenaline. Instead of bright parties and freedom of choice, he now had a schedule of getting up, having breakfast, and working. There was almost nothing on the walls of the cell but the dull light of the lamp and the cold gray of the concrete. The first days were shocking. He would sit on his bed for hours, staring at the wall and trying to comprehend how he had gotten to this point. In his dreams, that fateful moment kept coming back. Nick with the knife, the rage in his eyes, his own panic, the blow, and the blood. Waking up in a cold sweat, Brian felt trapped by his own actions. He received letters from his lawyer from time to time, telling him about the appeal and possible options to reduce his sentence. However, Brian was no longer very optimistic. He realized that 13 years was a long time, and even if they reduced it a little, his life would not be the same. He hardly ever talked to Melissa. She didn't write to him, didn't come to see him. He realized that he had ruined their marriage and that it was too late to save anything. But despite everything, hope sometimes awoke in his heart. What if she forgives me? What if she will wait? Although rationally he knew that he had hurt her too much. Translated with Depot.com free version, several times he dreamed about Bella. In those dreams, she stood in front of him, stretched out her arms, and then disappeared, disappearing into the darkness and leaving him in emptiness. He also understood that she was in unbearable pain. Her husband had died, and she was left with a sense of guilt. But he did not dare to write to her, afraid that it would cause her new pain. To cope with his depression, Brian signed up for prison psychological sessions, attended a support group where he listened to the stories of other prisoners. Sometimes he shared his own story. We started playing with fire, and I ruined my life. It was difficult for him to accept himself. Meanwhile, Melissa was living with her sister. She didn't want to stay in their luxurious apartment because everything reminded her of her lost love and the horrors that had happened. Later, she put the apartment up for sale so that she wouldn't have to return to that place. She planned to partially use the money to treat her mental trauma and start a new phase of her life. At first, she withdrew into herself, avoiding friends and social networks. She felt ashamed because many people knew her story of the exchange and may have judged her. On the street, it sometimes seemed that passers-by recognized her and whispered. It could have been an illusion, but she felt like all the attention was directed at her. At psychological counseling sessions, Melissa cried, confessing, I let myself get involved in this adventure. I was afraid of losing my husband. I didn't know how to talk to him about our problems. And now everything is ruined. He is in jail, and I am like a prisoner of my conscience. The therapist advised her to forgive herself because you can't do any worse, but you have to move on with your life. Gradually, Melissa started volunteering for a small charity project, helping to organize holidays for children from low-income families. This activity, although it didn't pay much, gave her back a sense of purpose. And the more she talked to those who had also gone through hardships, the more she realized that life does not end. Sometimes she received letters from Brian's lawyer asking her to sign some documents related to the appeal. She signed them, but did not write back to Brian. It was too painful to remember. Only once did she gather her courage and send a short note. I can't talk to you now. There is too much pain. I'm sorry. For Belia, the blow was double. She lost her husband, and her favorite driving life was shattered. In the first weeks after Nick's funeral, she was constantly tempted to follow him. Her guilt and grief were so strong. In addition, she had no moral right to be with Brian, and she didn't want to, because his name only evoked associations with her husband's death. Bella locked herself up at home, missing work. Her colleagues called and offered to help, but she remained silent. Later, when financial issues began to put pressure, she had to return to work. However, she felt that her colleagues looked at her with a mixture of pity and judgment. Some would mentally say, she's the reason for all this, while others, on the contrary, sympathized. She tried to pull herself together and go to psychotherapy, where she talked about her feelings. She was worried that it was her desire to spice things up in the marriage that pushed everyone to this experiment with exchange, and then to a secret affair with Brian. If she used to look for new experiences, now any thought of adventure disgusted her. Once a month, she visited Nick's grave, sat there with flowers and cried, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I didn't know it would turn out like this. But there was no answer. A year has passed. The events calmed down a bit in the media space. People switched to other news, although this story remained in the memory of many friends as a warning. During this time, Melissa never resumed contact with Brian. It was enough for her to learn from her lawyer that the appeal was unsuccessful and the sentence was upheld. She wondered if she should visit him someday, but did not dare. At the same time, she had a good friend in her life, from the volunteer circle, who showed her support. He didn't know all the details of the tragedy. He just saw that she was sad and wanted to help. Melissa was afraid of any relationship, so she kept her distance. But still, sometimes she caught herself thinking that the world hadn't ended and she needed some small light of hope. Bella sold the house where everything happened. She moved to a small apartment in another neighborhood. She went to work during the day, came back in the evening, and locked herself in. Sometimes she went to Nick's parents' house to help them, but they were full of grief and were reserved with her. On the one hand, they saw her as their son's wife, but on the other hand, they could not help but blame her for what led to his death. This complex ambivalence was exhausting for everyone. At some point, Bella decided that she needed to apologize to Melissa as well. She realized that they were both victims and accomplices in this situation, but she was afraid to take the first step. Finally, she wrote her a letter, not knowing if she would respond. Melissa, I don't know if you will ever be able to forgive me. I just want to say that I'm sorry for everything. It's not your fault. We were all immature and greedy for adventure. Please take care of yourself. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. When Melissa received the letter, she was confused at first. Part of her soul screamed, this woman destroyed your marriage and was involved in Nick's death. But another part of her said, she's suffering too. She's not a murderer, just a person who has stumbled. Several weeks passed before Melissa decided to respond. Finally, they met in a small park. The autumn wind whirled the leaves under their feet. They both looked sad and drained. They hugged each other in passing, barely holding back their tears. They sat down on a bench. Sam, I don't know where to start, whispered Bella. I'm so sorry. I don't know either, said Melissa, sighing. Maybe we have to accept that all this has happened, and nothing can be changed. They talked for a long time, recalling how they used to be friends in pairs, how they used to go on vacations together. They discussed how they felt about Brian and Nick, how they were lost in their own desires. Tears were interspersed with hugs. This is not to say that they forgave each other right away, But this meeting was the beginning of an emotional release. They realized that no one wanted death and destruction. They just acted carelessly and took risks. Maybe someday we can let it go, Melissa said in parting. Bella nodded silently. After that conversation, Melissa felt that she needed to close one more page. She decided to write a letter to Brian. Hello, she wrote. It's been a year. I still can't get over what happened. At the same time, I realized that our life did not end the moment you went to prison. It ended when we lost respect for each other. I do not hold hatred, only pain. I wish you strength in these years that you will have to serve. I am going on my way. Maybe someday I'll be able to come see you, but not now. Brian received the letter a few weeks later. He read it several times, feeling both grateful for the news and broken at the same time. He knew now that he could not count on a happy return to his family. But something in his soul was falling into place. At least Melissa did not wish him dead, did not openly curse him. He also hoped to say, I'm sorry to her someday. Meanwhile, several local journalists and bloggers were doing stories about the story, interviewing psychologists, priests, and sexologists about how this could have happened. It turned out that nowadays, swinging and free relationships are not unique, but they usually require a high level of mutual trust and agreement. If the initiative comes from boring, immature, or selfish motives, the consequences can be disastrous. On social media, many people supported Melissa as a victim of circumstances, while others criticized Bella for her frivolity. Some of the public considered Brian an aggressive egomaniac, while others defended his right to self-defense. But there was no more of that powerful wave of hype, only sporadic discussions that revolved around the topic of morality and personal responsibility. A few years later, Melissa was able to return to the event planning profession, but on a different level. She joined a charity foundation that organized holidays for orphans and families in need. She put her heart and soul into giving people positive things. Friends noted that her smile became a little sadder, but more sincere. In her personal life, she was very careful. She started a new relationship only 3 years later, when she met a man who could understand her past wounds. Bella also returned to life. She found the strength to change her field of activity, opened a small art space where she held creative workshops and helped young people to open up through art. Her pain for Nick will never go away, but over time, she has learned to live with this loss by honoring his memory through good deeds. Brian served his sentence while occasionally receiving short letters from either his sister or his lawyer. He took to studying in the prison library. He read books on psychology, self-development, and continued to program remotely under a special prison rehabilitation program. Rumor has it that he started consulting other prisoners who wanted to learn IT skills. 5 years have passed since the tragedy. One day, Melissa gathered her courage and came to see Brian in the penitentiary where he was in prison. She wanted to tell him that she held no grudges, that she realized they had both paid the price for their mistakes. When she saw him in the visiting room, her heart sank. He looked older. His youthful spunk had disappeared. But there was sadness in his eyes and at the same time relief that she had come. Hi, Melissa whispered. Honey. Hi, he replied quietly. Thank you for coming. I've been wondering if we'd ever see each other again. They talked for about an hour, about how they were young and didn't realize the consequences, about his regrets for his selfishness and betrayal, about her pain, which will forever remain a scar. In the end, Melissa said, I can't bring back the past, I don't want to. But I forgive you, and I want you to forgive yourself too, when you can. Brian sobbed, Thank you. That may be the most important thing I've heard in years. But they couldn't hug each other, so they remained seated opposite each other, separated by chairs in the warden's gaze. And yet it was a meeting that put a small end to the story of their pain.